like and subscribe for more videos like this.
Werewolves have always been I don't think mythical is the right word, but legendary, I suppose. A beast. So in this spooky season, we're going to read the legend of the werewolf. And then, oddly enough, run the Werewolf car by Lionel. Being pulled by the very spooky Halloween GP 35. And on the tail end, the eerie caboose. So enjoy the reading, relax, and we're going to run this. Thanks for joining me. We're running trains, reading and relaxing. And in this Halloween installment, or whenever you happen to be catching up, we're going to read the origin of the werewolf superstition, a 19th century text, and away we go. The belief that a human being is capable of assuming an animal's form, most frequently that of a wolf, is an almost worldwide superstition. Such a transformed person is of Germanic werewolf, or man-wolf, that is, a wolf which is really a human being. So the werewolf was a man in wolf's form or wolf's dress, seen mostly at night, and believed generally to be harmful to man. The origin of this werewolf superstition has not been satisfactorily explained. Adolf Ehrman explains the allusion of Herodotus to the transformation of the Nurians, the people of the present Volhynia in West Russia, into wolves as due merely to their appearance in winter, dressed in their furs. This explanation, however, would not fit similar superstitions in warm climes. Others ascribe the origin of lycanthropy to primitive totemism, in which the totem is an animal revered by the members of a tribe and supposed to be hostile to their enemies. Still another explanation is that of a leader of departed souls as the original werewolf. The explanation of the origin of the belief in werewolves must be one which will apply the world over, as the werewolf superstition is found pretty much all over the earth, especially today. However, in northwest Germany and Slavic lands, namely in the lands where the wolf is most common. According to Moog, the superstition prevails today, especially in the north and east of Germany. The werewolf superstition is an old one, a primitive one. The point in common everywhere is the transformation of a living human being into an animal, into a wolf in regions where the wolf was common, into a lion, hyena, or leopard in Africa, where these animals are common, into a tiger or serpent in India, in other localities into other animals characteristic of the region. Among Lapps and Finns occur transformations into the bear, wolf, reindeer, fish, or birds, among many North Asiatic people, as also some American Indians into the bear, amongst the latter also into the fox, wolf, turkey, or owl. In South America, besides into a tiger or jaguar, also into a fish or serpent. Most universal thought, it seems, was the transformation into wolves or dogs. As the superstition is so widespread, Germany, Eastern Europe, Africa, Asia, America, it either arose at a very early time, when all these peoples were in communication with each other, or else, in accordance with another view of modern science, it arose independently in various continents in process of the natural physical development of the human race under similar conditions. The origin of the superstition must have been an old custom of primitive man's of putting on a wolf's or other animal's skin, or dress or robe. Thus, likely also the notion of attributing speech to animals originated from disguising or dressing of men as animals. In the following we shall examine into primitive man's reasons for putting on such a skin or robe. Primitive man was face to face with animal foes and had to conquer them or be destroyed. The werewolf superstition in Europe arose probably while the Greeks, Romans, Celts, and Germanic people were still in contact with each other, if not in the original Indo-Germanic home, for they all have the superstition. Unless, as above, we prefer to regard the belief as arising in various localities and process of psychical development under similar conditions, namely when people still live principally by the chase. Probably primitive Indo-European man before and at the time of the origin of the werewolf superstition was almost helpless in the presence of exorable nature. This was before he used metal for weapons. The great business of life was to secure food. Food was furnished from three sources: roots, berries, animals, and the most important of these was animals. Without efficient weapons, it was difficult to kill an animal of any size. In fact, the assailant was likely himself to be killed. Yet primitive man had to learn master the brute foe. Without efficient weapons, it was difficult to kill an animal of any size. Soon he had no longer crouched in sheltered places and avoided the enemy, but began to watch and study it, to learn its habits, to learn what certain animals would do under certain circumstances, to learn what would frighten them away or would lure them on. So at least the large animals were to early man a constant cause of fear and source of danger, yet it was unnecessary to have their flesh for food and their skin for clothing. Very soon various ingenious contrivances were devised for trapping them. No doubt one primitive method was the use of decoys to lure animals into trap. Some could be lured by baits, others more easily by their kind. Occasionally masks were used, and similarly another form of the original decoy was no doubt simply the stuffed skin of a member of the species, whether animal or bird, say for example a wild duck. Of course the hunter would soon hit on the plan of himself putting on the animal's skin, in the case of larger species, whether animal or bird. That is, an individual dressed, for example, in a wolf's skin could approach near enough to a solitary wolf to attack it with a club, stone, or other weapon, without exciting the wolf's suspicion of the nearness of the dangerous foe. So the animal disguise, entire or partial, was used by early man acting in the capacity of a decoy, firstly, to secure food and clothing. Secondly, he would assume animal disguise, whole or partial, in dancing and singing, and both these accomplishments seem to have arisen from the imitation of the motions and cries of animals. At first to lure them, when acting as a decoy. With growth of culture came growth of supernaturalism, and an additional reason for acquiring dance and song was to secure charms against bodily ills, and finally enlivenment. In both dance and song, when used for a serious purpose, the performers imagined themselves to be the animals they were imitating, and in the dance they wore the skins of the animals represented. Probably as long as animal form, partial or entire, were assumed merely for decoys and sport, early dancing, for peaceful purposes therefore, such as having whole or partial animal shape, were not regarded as harmful to man, just as wise women began to pass for witches only when their art they did evil. A similar development can be traced in the case of masks. It was some time before man could cope with food and clothing furnishings animals that were dangerous to life, though these are the ones he first studied, and we cannot presuppose that he disguised to represent them until he could cope with them, since the original purpose of the disguise was to secure food and clothing. Thus far, then, we see whole or partial disguise as animals used to secure food and clothing, when acting as decoys to lure animals, and in dancing. Fourthly, primitive man would put on animal skin or dress when out as a forager or a spy for the purpose of avoiding detection by the enemy. The Pawnee Indians, for example, were called by neighboring tribes wolves, probably not out of contempt, since it may be doubted that an Indian feels contempt for a wolf any more than he does for a fox, a rabbit, or an elk, but because of their adroitness as scouts, warriors, and stealers of horses, or as the Pawnees think, because of their great endurance, their skill in imitating wolves so as to escape detection by the enemy by day or night, or according to some neighborhood tribes, because they prowl like wolves, having the endurance of wolves, can travel all day and dance at night, can make long journeys, living on the carcasses they find on the way, or on no food at all. And further, the Pawnees, when they were on the warpath, were always prepared to simulate wolves. Wolves on the prairie were too common to excite remark, and at night they would approach close to the Indian camps. The Pawnee, starting off on the warpath, usually carried a robe made of wolf skins, or in later times a white blanket or a white sheet, and at night wrapped himself in this. And getting down on his hands and knees, he walked or trotted here or there like a wolf, having thus transformed himself into a common object of the landscape. This disguise was employed by day as well for reconnaissance. While the party remained hidden in some ravine or hollow, one Indian would put his robe over him and gallop to the top of the hill on all fours, and would sit there on his haunches looking all over the country, and anyone at a distance who saw him would take him for a wolf. It was acknowledged on all hands that Pawnees could imitate wolves best. An Indian going into an enemy's country is often called a wolf, and the sign for a scout is made up of the signs wolf and look. Should any scout detect danger, as at night when on duty near an encampment, he must give the cry of a coyote. The idea of the harmfulness to other men of a man in animal form or dress became deeply seated now, when men in animal disguise began to not act only as decoys for animals dangerous to life, but also as scouts, robbers, and later possessors of supernatural power. When growth of culture brought with it the growth of supernaturalism, when people began to associate, for example, the wolf's form with a lurking enemy. All uncivilized tribes of the world are continually on the defensive, like our American Indian. They all no doubt on occasion have sent out scouts who, like our American Indians, to avoid detection, assume the disguise of the animal most common to the special locality in question. Just as today, they are known to disguise in animal skins for purposes of plunder or revenge. The kind of animal makes no difference. The underlying principle is the same, namely, the transformation of a living human being into an animal. The origin of the belief in such a transformation, as stated above, was the simple putting on of animal skin by early man. The objective of putting on animal skin was to gain food, to secure clothing, to imitate when decoying. Scouts disguised themselves as animals while out foraging as well for welfare, for the purposes of revenge, to inspire terror in the opposing agent by symbolizing superhuman agencies, and witchcraft. It's very easy to see why it was usually the so-called medicine men, most correctly shamans, who claimed such transformative power because they received remuneration from their patients. Finally, dreams and exaggerated reports gave rise to fabulous stories. We have discussed 1, 2, and 3, and for example under 4 we have cited the practices of American Indians. It is probable that about now, at the stage indicated in 4 above, what is known as the real werewolf superstition, that of a frenzied, rabid man-wolf, began to fully develop. The man in wolf skin was already a lurking thief or enemy or destroyer of human life. To advance from this stage to a werewolf frenzy, our primitive man must have seen about him some exhibition of such frenzy, and some reason for connecting this frenzy particularly with, say, the wolf. He did see insane persons, and the connecting link would be crazy or mad wolf, or dog, as the transformation was usually into a wolf or dog. For persons bitten by it usually went mad too. The ensuing frenzy, with the consternation it occasioned, soon appealed to certain primitive minds as good means of terrorizing others. Or these mad ones, some no doubt actually had the malady. Others honestly believed they had gotten into a frenzy accordingly. Others purposely worked themselves up into a frenzy in order to impose on the uninitiated. Later in the Middle Ages, when the nature of the real disease came to be better understood, the werewolf superstition had become too firmly fixed to be easily uprooted. We've discussed 5, 6, and 7, and 8 in the notes. As further examples of the development into fabulous story, we might cite any of those stories in which the wild werewolf would be obliged to live on food he found on his way, and later fabulous report would represent him as himself when in disguise possessing the attributes of an animal he represented, and tearing into pieces man and beast. For such an account, see Andre, concerning what eyewitnesses reported of the wild reveling over corpses of the hyena men of Africa. Naturally, the uninitiated savages who witnessed such a sight would become insane, or at least would spread abroad such a report that would enhance the influence of the hyena men far and wide. Some, as in Africa, came to regard any animal that robbed them of children, goats, or other animals as a witch in animal form, just as the American Indians ascribed to evil spirits death, sickness, and other misfortunes. We can see how at first the man in animal disguise or an animal robe would go quietly to work, like the Pawnee Scout. How, though, as soon as the element of magic enters in, he would try to keep up the illusion. At this stage, when the original defense measure has been tainted with superstition, men would go about the nighttime howling and holding their vile revels. Andre narrates how a soldier in northern Africa shot a hyena, followed the traces of blood, and came to the straw hut of a man who was widely famed as a magician. No hyena was to be seen, only the man himself with a fresh wound. Soon he died, however, and the soldier did not survive him long. Doubtless, one of the magician class was responsible for the death of the soldier, just as we today put to death the man who so violates our laws as to become a menace to our society, or as formerly kings killed those who stood in their way, or as religious sects murdered those who dissent from their faith. These magicians, supposed to be men who could assume animal form, as a matter of fact, do often form a class, are greatly feared by other natives, often dwell with their disciples in caves, and at night come forth to plunder and kill. It is to their interest to counterfeit well, for if suspected of being malevolent, they were put to death or outlawed like criminals today. Their frenzies were, as said above, in some cases genuine delusions. In other cases they offered, as one may readily imagine, excellent opportunities for personal gain or vengeance. Only by instilling in their fellows a firm belief in the superstition and maintaining the sham could the perpetrators of the outrages hope to escape punishment for their depredations. Could they hope to plunder and steal with impunity? So they prowled usually under the cloak of night, or in the dark of the forest, howled and acted like the animals they represented, hid the animal skin or blanket if they used one, in the daytime where they thought no one could find it, whereas the animal skin, which is worn for defense, was put on either by day or night. And one story recounts the swallowing of a whole goat, the man bellowing fearfully like a tiger when he did it. Some of the transformed men claim they could regain human form only by means of a certain medicine or by rubbing. The impostors were the criminal class of society that still is with us today, no longer in werewolf form, but after all wolves in human dress, each maintaining his trade by deception and countless artifices, just as did the werewolf of old. Not unlike these shams are those of the American who in church, when shouting, that is, when stirred by religious fervor, indicates blows on his enemy who happened to be in the church, of course with impunity, for he's supposed to be under some outside control, and when the spell is passed, like some of the delusionists mention, claim not to know what he or generally she has done. Similar also are ceremonies such as those of fire eaters or any other sham. The wolf disguise or transformation into a werewolf is the most often assumed, for example, in Germanic lands. The term wolf became synonymous with robber, and later when the robber became an outlaw with outlaw. The robber and outlaw alike being called wolf and not some other animal, i.e. only the Wolfman surviving to extent. Firstly because the wolf was plentiful, and secondly because as civilization advanced, there came a time when the wolf was practically the only one of the larger undomesticated animals that survived. We can notice in this our own United States, for example, in eastern Kansas, where at night coyotes and even wolves are sometimes heard howling out on the prairies near woodlands, or in the pastures adjoining farms, where they not infrequently kill small animals and dig up buried ones. In Prussia, also, is the wolf that survives today. American Indians and others, however, do not restrict the transformations to the wolf, because other wild animals are, or will till recently, abundant amongst domestic animals as the pig, white bull, dog superseded them. When the stage was reached as time went on, and means of successful coping with the brute creation became domestic animal as the pig, white bull, dog superseded them. When the stage was reached as time went on and means of successful coping with the brute created became perfected, the animals were shorn of many of their terrors, and finally such stories as Aesop's fables would arise. This, however, was psychologically a long step in advance of our werewolf-believing peoples of the early period. Up to this point, the illusions have shown that the world of superstition went through various stages of development. The motives for assuming wolf's dress, or animal skins or robes, at first were purely peaceful, for protecting against cold, and to secure food for acting as decoys. Then it was used for personal advantage or gained by foragers or robbers and spies, then for the purpose of vengeance, later for the desire for power over others, and finally men, the professional and the superstitious, began to concoct fabulous stories which were handed down as tradition or myth, according to the psychic level of the narrator and hearer. The starting point of the whole superstition of the harmful werewolf is the disguising as some common animal by members of races or abroad as foragers or scouts in order to escape detection by the enemy. Like wolves, they roamed the land in search of food, as stated above. Later fabulous report would represent them as possession, in their disguise, the attributes of an animal that impersonated, and finally even of actually taking on animal form, either wholly or in part, for longer or shorter periods of time. Some disguised the attributes of the animals they impersonated, and finally even on actually taking on the animal's form. Some of the North American Indian transformation stories represent men to have only one head and the feet of a wolf. The transformation into a werewolf in Germanic lands is caused merely by a shirt or a girdle made of wolf skin. This shirt or girdle of wolf skin of the Germanic werewolf is the survival of the robe or mantle originally disguising the entire body. It would be but a step further to represent a person as rendering himself invisible by putting on any other article of appeal, such as a tarnkop. The stories, especially in Europe, were of the werewolf rather than bear or other animal, because the wolf was the commonest of the large wild animals. It was stories of the commonest animal, the wolf, which crystallized into the household werewolf, or transformation tales. And that concludes the 19th century, the origin of the werewolf superstition. I hope you've enjoyed this reading. I've been bored to death, not to death literally, but to relaxation, and enjoyed some of the trains along the way as well. Thanks, as always, for tuning in.